There is a word in the Kreth language, Veilshun, that has no direct translation in Galactic Standard. The closest approximation is the silence before something that cannot be stopped. For 300 years, the Kreth Dominion had been that silence. 27 star systems, 11 subjugated species, a fleet so vast that when it moved through a system's orbit, it blotted out the sun for 6 full rotations. The Kreth did not conquer through war alone. War was loud, expensive, and left infrastructure in ruins. They conquered through gravity, through the simple, suffocating reality that resistance cost more than submission, and that everyone who had ever tried to resist them was now a footnote in a history the Kreth themselves had written. The Galactic Senate debated them endlessly. Resolutions were passed. Sanctions were proposed. Trade agreements were leveraged. Ambassadors were exchanged. And in the outer systems, on worlds whose names the Senate couldn't pronounce, the Kreth continued to do what the Kreth had always done. They pressed down, slowly, until something broke. The Senate had a term for it: managed tension, a polite phrase for the policy of letting smaller species bear weight that the larger ones were unwilling to lift. There was one species the Senate always walked carefully around when drafting these resolutions: humanity. Not because humans were the most powerful. They weren't, not yet. Not by the metrics the Senate used. Not because humans had the largest fleet or the most territory. They had neither. It was something harder to quantify. Something in the way human ambassadors sat in the chamber, still, watchful, saying little, that made the species around them shift in their seats. Something in the human history files that, when studied carefully, showed a pattern that no other species had ever demonstrated. Humans had been threatened to extinction twice. Both times, the threatening party had ceased to exist. Not defeated, not conquered, ceased to exist. And so the Senate managed its tensions carefully, and humanity sat in the corner of the chamber, and the Kreth pressed down on worlds that had no advocates, and the galaxy turned. Until the night the Pale Man came to Kreth Prime. His name, the name they used for him, since no one knew the real one, was a translation problem. In Veth, it was Korvesht, the wound that does not announce itself. In Drali, it was Sun Pale, the one who walks in the space between heartbeats. In Galactic Standard, the underworld had settled on something simpler: the Pale Man. He had been operating for, estimates varied, somewhere between 8 and 15 years. No one was certain because attribution was a puzzle. When a Kreth garrison commander on Velis IV was found in his locked quarters with no visible cause of death, and every piece of sensitive intelligence on his personal server wiped clean, the Pale Man got the credit. When a cartel processing hub on the Merit Corridor went silent mid-operation, every guard down, every prisoner freed, no witnesses, the Pale Man. When High Collector Dreth of the Veth Consolidated Authority was delivered, breathing and intact, to a galactic tribunal he had spent 4 years evading, bound with standard restraints and accompanied only by a data chip containing enough evidence to bury him for 11 consecutive lifetimes, the Pale Man. The debate that consumed 3 separate galactic intelligence agencies was simple. Who does he work for? The Drali believed he was a human Black Ops operative, an instrument of quiet human foreign policy, plausible deniability wrapped in a pale coat and dead eyes. The Veth believed he was a syndicate asset, a weapon some criminal empire had perfected over decades. The Kreth publicly called him a myth, a scapegoat, a story smaller species told themselves to feel less helpless. Privately, Kreth intelligence had a file on him 47 pages long. Most of it was inference and approximation. There were 3 confirmed visual captures, blurry, partial, taken from cameras that had died seconds after the image was captured, as if he had allowed them 1 frame before deciding even that was too generous. In all 3 images he was the same: medium height, lean, moving with a stillness that made cameras struggle to resolve him properly. His face, in a single frame where it was partially visible, was calm. Not the calm of a being suppressing emotion. The calm of a being for whom this was simply Tuesday. Kreth Intelligence's Behavioral Analysis Division had produced a 17-page document on that face. Their conclusion, which the division head had flagged as speculative but submitted anyway, was this. The subject does not appear to experience fear in any standard operational context. We do not know if this is training, modification, pathology, or simply what human beings look like when they have fully committed to a course of action. We recommend treating this uncertainty as a threat in itself. The document was classified Tier 1 and shown to exactly 4 people. One of those 4 people was Supreme Warlord Kreth Dominion, Grand Executor of the Kreth people, and the single most feared individual in the known galaxy. He had read it once, set it down, and said nothing. He was not accustomed to reading about things that frightened him. He found he did not enjoy the experience. 6 months before the night the Pale Man came to Kreth Prime, the Dominion did something that crossed a line so fundamental that even the Senate could not paper over it with managed tension. They glassed Suura. Suura was a Class 3 colony world, population 1.2 million. Mostly Drawli, some Veth, a handful of mixed-species settlers who had built something quiet and agrarian on a world the Kreth had decided they wanted for mineral extraction. The colonial government had filed 42 formal objections with the Senate over 4 years. They had hired advocates. They had paid for legal proceedings. They had done everything the Senate's processes asked of them. The Kreth had waited patiently for the processes to exhaust themselves. Then they had sent 3 ships and burned Suura's atmosphere from orbit. It took 11 hours. They cited a provision in the Dominion's foundational charter allowing military action against worlds harboring anti-Kreth insurgents. There were no insurgents on Suura. There had never been insurgents on Suura. The provision was 300 years old and had never been used because everyone had understood it was a theoretical instrument. The Kreth had decided they were tired of theoretical instruments. In the Senate chamber, 89 species voted to condemn the action. 12 abstained. 3 voted against condemnation. The resolution passed by an enormous margin and carried precisely 0 enforcement weight because the body empowered to enforce it was the Kreth Dominion's own treaty fleet. Human Ambassador Yarachun sat through the full 12-hour session without speaking. She voted to condemn. She filed the standard documentation. She walked out of the chamber with the same expression she had worn walking in, still, watchful, saying nothing. A journalist from the Drawli Independent Press caught her in the corridor and asked what humanity would do. She looked at him for a moment. "The Senate has spoken," she said, and she walked away. 3 weeks later, Kreth Intelligence flagged an anomaly in their sensor net around Kreth Prime. A brief gap, 4.7 seconds, in the outer detection grid. Unexplained, attributed to equipment error. They were wrong. Kreth Prime at night was a monument to the aesthetics of dominance. The capital city of Varketh rose in brutal geometric towers of black stone and polished metal, lit from within by the deep amber glow the Kreth preferred, a color that in their biology signaled authority and territorial claim. The Warlord's citadel sat at the city's center, a structure that had taken 4,000 Drawli slave laborers 11 years to build, and that the Kreth had never acknowledged had been built by slaves at all. It rose 40 stories above the surrounding towers, ringed by 3 layers of defense, staffed by the Dominion's finest warriors, and monitored by a security grid that the Kreth had spent 2 decades and an obscene sum of credits ensuring was the most advanced in the known galaxy. The Pale Man came in through the atmospheric processing stack on the Citadel's eastern face. The stack was not on any official schematic. It had been added during a renovation 14 years ago and had never been formally integrated into the security documentation. The Pale Man had found this gap 6 weeks ago in files that were not supposed to be accessible to anyone outside Kreth High Command, obtained through methods that 7 different intelligence agencies would have given significant resources to understand. The entry required him to climb 40 meters of exterior surface in Kreth Prime's atmosphere. Oxygen sufficient for humans, but with a gravity 1.3 times standard, which made every movement cost more than it should. His fingers found gaps in the stone that were not designed to be handholds. He made them handholds anyway. At the top, a ventilation grate, sealed with a magnetic lock rated for significant force. He bypassed it in 40 seconds using a tool that had taken him 3 months to build. He entered the citadel and was still. The first guard was Kreth, 2 meters tall, for arms, the dense armored hide that made the species so difficult to put down in direct combat. His name was Warden 3rd UXVEL, and he was good at his job. He had served the Citadel for 9 years. He had an instinct for wrongness, a sense that veteran security personnel develop, an animal awareness of space that has changed. He felt it now, in the corridor outside processing Stack 7. Something was different. He turned, weapon rising, and the pale man came from the ceiling. Not from behind, not from the side, from above, from a maintenance brace that no one thought to watch because the ceiling was 12 feet high and nothing climbed ceilings. The pale man had been there for 4 minutes, motionless, waiting for the guard's patrol to bring him to exactly the right position. What followed was not a fight. It was a transaction. The guard's weapon came up, and the pale man's hand was already there, redirecting the muzzle, using the guard's own four-armed reach against him. Too many limbs, too much to coordinate in a sudden close grapple. A precise strike to the nerve cluster where the Kreth's secondary neck met the shoulder plating. Then another, lower, to the joint where the armored hide thinned. UXVEL had time to register that something was happening, and then the darkness took him cleanly. He would wake up in 6 hours with a headache and his career in ruins. The pale man checked the body carefully. Breathing. Pulse strong. He moved on. The second and third guards were stationed at the inner corridor junction. Standard double coverage, motion sensors between them, creating overlapping detection fields. The pale man stopped 12 meters away and studied the pattern of the sensors for 90 seconds. He had studied it before from the schematics, but schematics and reality always had a margin of error, and he had learned long ago that the margin was where people died. The sensors swept in a 4.2-second cycle with a 0.8-second gap at the leftmost edge of the left-hand unit. 0.8 seconds was not enough time to cross the corridor. He spent 11 minutes redirecting a coolant line to create a temperature drop in the left sensor's detection field, just enough to cause a calibration hiccup, extending the gap to 1.4 seconds. Then he crossed the corridor. The guards never looked up. He put them both down in the next 30 seconds. Fast, clean, calibrated to the milligram of force required to incapacitate without permanent damage. He noted, professionally, that the third guard had reacted faster than he expected. A younger warrior. Good instincts. Not good enough. He was 4 corridors from the warlord's chamber when the alarm went silent. Not went off. Went silent. One of the internal sensors, somewhere behind him, had detected an anomaly and flagged it. And then the flag had been intercepted by a program he'd installed in the Citadel security net 3 weeks ago via a remote intrusion that Kreth Intelligence would, in a post-incident review, describe as theoretically impossible. The program ate the alert and reported the sensor as having experienced a routine calibration error. He had 17 minutes before the program's presence became statistically detectable. He moved. The 4th through 9th guards he encountered in the inner sanctum approach presented escalating challenges. These were the warlord's personal household warriors, the Grathkel, chosen killers who had each won their position through combat. They were not standard security. They knew their ground. They expected threats from known vectors. The pale man had spent 5 weeks ensuring he was not a known vector. He took the 4th from beneath a floor grate. The Kreth had never thought to armor the floors, a gap in doctrine born from the reasonable assumption that nothing infiltrating their citadel would be small enough and patient enough to use the service infrastructure. He took the 5th and 6th together, timing his emergence to the precise moment their patrol rhythm put them both facing away from him, using a non-lethal aerosol compound he'd synthesized from components available in the Citadel's own medical bay, a fact he found professionally satisfying. The 7th guard saw him, actually saw him, turn at the right moment, by instinct or fortune, and their eyes met in the corridor's amber light for a single frozen second. The guard was good. He didn't shout, didn't reach for a communicator. He attacked immediately, bringing his plasma blade up in the standard Kreth opening form, a diagonal slash designed to force a defensive response and create the opening for the real strike to follow. The pale man did not respond defensively. He stepped into the slash, inside the arc, where the blade had no leverage, absorbed the guard's forearm across his own, and turned the kinetic energy sideways, using the Kreth's size and momentum as a lever. 140 kilos of armored alien predator went into the wall at speed. The impact was loud, uncomfortably loud. The pale man stood over the down guard, breathing controlled, and listened. 30 seconds. No response from the corridor. He reset a dislocated finger he had caught on the guard's armor plating. A sharp, practiced movement, no sound, and kept moving. The 8th and 9th guards he bypassed entirely through a route they had not thought to cover, because the route required crawling through a space that their physical profile made impossible and their doctrine had therefore never considered. He reached the warlord's chamber. He stopped outside the door. He was bleeding from a laceration on his left forearm. The 7th guard's blade had kissed him on the rotation. He pressed a wound seal to it, one-handed, without looking. He rolled his neck once. Check his pulse. 64 BPM. He opened the door. Supreme Warlord Kreth was not asleep. He had not achieved his position by sleeping soundly in the assumption of safety. He was standing at the far end of his chamber, a vast, dark space hung with the trophies of 40 years of personal combat, and he was already facing the door when it opened. He had heard the impact in the corridor, had heard it, assessed it, and decided. In the time it took most beings to process that something was wrong, Kreth had stripped off his ceremonial robes, retrieved his weapons, and positioned himself with the room's terrain at his advantage. He was, and this was not propaganda, genuinely one of the most dangerous beings alive. Kreth stood 2.5 meters tall. He massed somewhere above 300 kilos of natural armor and muscle that had been further refined by 4 decades of combat, so consistent it had reshaped his physiology. His 4 arms bore the ritual scarring of the Kelverith, the Kreth ceremony of ascension that required a warrior to fight 3 opponents simultaneously and kill all 3. He had performed the ceremony twice. The second time had been his own idea. His eyes, 6 of them, arranged in the Kreth's wide arc of peripheral vision, found the pale man immediately. Silence. Kreth had faced many enemies. Generals, champions, assassins. None of them had looked at him like this. Like the threat assessment was already complete and had already reached a conclusion. Human, he said. Warlord, said the pale man. Kreth moved first. He came in with terrifying speed for his size. A truth about Kreth physiology that surprised most opponents once and surprised no one twice. He crossed half the chamber in 3 strides and brought his primary blade down in a vertical strike that would have separated most beings cleanly at the shoulder junction. The pale man moved left, not back, left, perpendicular to the strike, which was the wrong direction by every conventional combat logic because it moved him toward Kreth's body rather than away from it. The blade split the air where he had been. He was already inside the warlord's reach, and he drove a strike into the nerve cluster just below Kreth's secondary arm junction, the same cluster he'd used on the first guard, with every gram of weight he could put behind it. On the first guard, it had ended the fight. On Kreth, it made him flinch. One arm went momentarily numb. The warlord turned it into a rotation, spinning his mass and using his elbow as a ram, catching the pale man across the chest and sending him backward. The pale man hit the floor and rolled, with it dissipating force, coming up in a low stance 3 meters away. His chest burned. 2 ribs he cataloged, possibly cracked. He breathed through it. Grotvel pressed. He came in with all 4 arms working, a pattern of overlapping strikes designed to overwhelm a 2-limbed opponent's ability to process and respond. Left high, right low, secondary left sweeping to cut off retreat, secondary right maintaining weapon pressure. It was masterful, genuinely masterful, the product of decades of refinement. The pale man didn't try to block it. He dropped beneath it entirely, going to the floor and driving himself forward between Kreth's legs, a space the warlord's size made larger than intended, and came up behind him. He drove the reinforced heel of his palm into the base of Kreth's spine at the junction where even Kreth armor thinned to allow flexibility. Kreth roared, the first sound of real pain, and wheeled, and this time his backhand connected, and the pale man went sideways into a display case of trophies that shattered around him. He lay in the debris for 1.3 seconds. In those 1.3 seconds he assessed. Left arm functional but compromised. 2 ribs cracked, not broken, breathing still full. Laceration on his scalp from the case's frame, blood beginning to track into his left eye. Right hand fully operational. He got up. Grathvel stared at him from across the room. Even the Warlord, a being who had killed 41 named opponents in personal combat and lost count of the unnamed, felt something shift in his chest at that, because he had hit this creature hard enough to put a Kreth warrior down. He had watched the human go into the wall with his own eyes, and the human had paused for barely a breath and stood back up and was looking at him with those same dead star eyes that had not changed at all. No rai, no fear, no desperation, calculation. What are you? Grathvel said. Focused, said the pale man. He was already moving. What followed was 4 minutes that neither of them would have been able to fully articulate afterward. Not Grathvel, because he did not survive, and not the pale man, because he did not speak of such things. It was not a beautiful fight. It was not the choreographed exchanges of the Kreth combat traditions. It was ugly and brutal and relentless, and what made it terrifying, what would have made any witness lose sleep, was that the pale man did not fight like a being trying to win. He fought like a being executing a plan. Every exchange cost him. Grathvel was simply, physically, more than a human body was built to absorb. A block strike that would have been manageable from a smaller opponent here was a dislocated shoulder. A glancing blow that would have been an inconvenience was a probable concussion. By the second minute, the pale man was bleeding from 3 separate sources, and his left arm was at effectively 40% function. He did not slow down. He was hurting the Warlord. Barely perceptibly. A quarter step here, an angled retreat there. Guiding Grathvel's aggression, using the Warlord's own drive to press and dominate, steering him with invisible hands across the room. Grathvel, whose tactical mind was genuinely formidable, felt the current but could not identify its source. Every time he thought he had the momentum, the pale man was somewhere slightly wrong, slightly not where he should be. The Warlord's trophy cases lined the eastern wall. The largest at the center was sealed behind reinforced glass, a display of confiscated weapons from the 41 opponents he had killed. Blades, sidearms, exotic weapons from a dozen species. And at the center, mounted with great prominence, a human combat knife. The trophy from his only human kill 20 years ago. A mercenary who had been hired to stop him and had come close enough to scar him before he ended it. He had been proud of that scar. He drove the pale man toward the eastern wall. The human was flagging. He could see it, the left arm barely responding, the breathing elevated now, the blood loss accumulating. He had taken tremendous damage. No one, not once, had taken this much from Grathvel and still been standing. But he was still standing less well now than a minute ago. Grathvel came in with his killing stroke, a combination he had refined over 40 years, primary blade high to force the head down, secondary right sweeping low to take the legs, the real strike following in the opening created. The pale man broke the pattern. He didn't guard high. He took the blade across the left shoulder, took it, let it hit, let the arm go dead, and dropped his weight entirely, going not down but forward directly into Grathvel's center mass. His right elbow connected with the Warlord's primary throat structure at the exact moment Grathvel's own momentum was fully committed forward. It was not enough to finish it. Nothing so simple would finish Grathvel, but it pushed him backward, one step, into the trophy case. The reinforced glass cracked behind the Warlord's back. The pale man's right hand went through the crack, through the glass, ignoring the edges entirely, and closed on the handle of the human combat knife mounted inside. Grathvel saw what he had done. His own trophy, his own case. He grabbed for the pale man's right wrist with all 4 hands, and he was faster than he should have been, and he caught it, 4 armored hands against 1 human wrist, the knife 4 inches from his throat, the pale man's arm trembling with everything he had against a force that should have been immovable. For 3 seconds they were completely still. The Pale Man looked at him. Grathvel looked back. And then the Pale Man did something no one had ever done in 41 personal combats against Grathvel, in 40 years of warfare, in 300 years of Kreth Dominion history. He smiled, not in triumph, not in madness, in recognition, as if to say, "You see it too. You know how this ends." And while every one of Grathvel's 6 eyes was fixed on the knife 4 inches from his throat, while all 4 of his arms were committed to that wrist, the Pale Man's left arm, the dead arm, the arm that had taken the blade and gone non-functional, executed one final movement. Not a powerful one, not a forceful one. He didn't need force anymore. He needed precision. 2 fingers of his left hand, acting purely on the memory the body holds when the mind can no longer direct it, found the gap in the armored hide beneath Grathvel's lower left jaw. The gap that every Kreth had, the structural weakness in their otherwise formidable natural armor, documented in xenobiology files that most species never thought to cross-reference with combat applications. The Pale Man had cross-referenced them. The nerve cluster there was not a killing point. It was a paralysis point, temporary, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, affecting the voluntary motor control of the upper body. 30 seconds was more than enough. Grathvel's 4 arms released. The knife moved. The Kreth found him at 6 o'clock station time, when a morning guard rotation discovered that 9 warriors were unconscious in the corridors and the Warlord was not responding to his morning summons. Supreme Warlord Grathvel, Sword of the Dominion, Grand Executor, the single most feared individual in the known galaxy, was seated in his own chair, at his own desk, in a posture almost resembling dignity. His own combat knife was in his hand, placed there, carefully, deliberately, as though someone had wanted to give it back. By 6:30, Kreth Prime was in full lockdown. By 7 o'clock, the news had reached the Senate. By 9 o'clock, the chamber was in uproar, and the managed tension that 17 bodies of galactic governance had spent 30 years carefully maintaining was coming apart at the seams. Every intelligence agency in the galaxy began asking the same question simultaneously. Who? The Kreth blamed humanity immediately, publicly, and at maximum volume. An act of war. A declaration of hostility. The Dominion's new High Commander, still pale beneath her armored hide, still processing the information that Grathvel was simply gone, stood before the Senate chamber and demanded answers from the human delegation. Ambassador Yara Chun sat with the same stillness she always sat with. "We condemn all acts of political violence," she said when given the floor. Her voice was calm. Her hands were folded on the table. The Senate record will show that humanity voted to censure the Kreth Dominion's action at Suura. The Senate record will also show that we proposed an enforcement mechanism, which was voted down by this body. She paused. "We had nothing to do with this. But I will observe that when the Senate fails to act, the galaxy finds its own equilibrium." She sat down. The chamber erupted. The Drali were quieter in their conclusions, but their intelligence service's preliminary report, distributed to allied species within 48 hours, noted that the operational profile matched known Pale Man methodology. The lack of fatalities among the guards, the precision, the patience, the impossibility of the infiltration route. The report concluded, with 73% confidence, that the Pale Man was a human state asset, a conclusion that the Drali's ambassador communicated to the human delegation privately, with significant diplomatic weight behind it. The human delegation acknowledged receipt of the communication. They neither confirmed nor denied. The Veth went further, producing a 40-page analysis arguing that the Pale Man was the leading edge of a covert human expansion strategy, that humanity was removing obstacles to its own galactic rise, one targeted assassination at a time, with precision and plausible deniability. The analysis was compelling. It was also classified, but it leaked within a week because everything leaked, and for a month it was the most discussed document in galactic politics. In the Kreth Dominion, leaderless, the succession crisis tearing at its internal structure, 3 of its subjugated species already filing for restored autonomy with the Senate while the Dominion was too distracted to push back, went very, very quiet. On Suura's sister worlds, on the planets that had filed 42 objections and received 42 non-responses, something remarkable happened. People exhaled. In a mid-range medical facility on a station whose name appears in no intelligence file connected to any of this, a human male was processed under a false identity as a patient presenting with multiple blunt trauma injuries, 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, significant blood loss, and lacerations requiring closure. The attending physician, a drawly, competent, and incurious, accustomed to not asking questions, treated him, filed the paperwork under the false name, and moved on. The man lay in the recovery unit for 6 hours. His heart rate, even then, was 62 BPM. He had no handler, no debrief to attend, no agency waiting for his report. No one knew where he was because no one knew he existed. Not the real him, not the actual person beneath the operational identity, not the human government, which was entirely sincere in its denials, not any syndicate or cartel or intelligence service. He existed in the gap between what the galaxy believed was possible and what one person, with enough time and enough patience and enough controlled fury at a universe that pressed down on the people who had no one to press back, could actually accomplish. He had seen the files on Suura, had read every one of the 42 objections, had read the Senate record, had read the impact assessments. 1.2 million people. He had done the math that the Senate hadn't. Had asked the question the Senate wouldn't. If the process fails, what remains? He'd looked at the answer for a long time. Then he had gotten to work. When he was cleared for discharge, he dressed, settled the false name account, and walked out of the facility into the station's artificial morning. He paused in the corridor, tilted his head slightly, and appeared to be listening to something no one else could hear. Then he walked away. He had the name of another warlord. He had time. He had, as he always had, patience. The galaxy would spend the next decade arguing about who had sent him, what it meant, what humanity intended, what the balance of power now was. Think pieces and intelligence assessments and Senate resolutions and 1,000 conversations in 1,000 corridors about the shape of things to come. He didn't read those pieces. He wasn't working for the shape of things to come. He was working for the 1.2 million people who had filed 42 objections and been answered with fire. He was working because someone had to. He was working because he was very, very good at it. And because the galaxy, for all its size and age and accumulated wisdom, had never quite grasped what it actually meant when it encountered an animal that had climbed its way to the top of every food chain it had ever entered, and then looked up and found there was still more to climb. There were no senators where he was going. There were no resolutions. There was only the next name, and the silence before something that cannot be stopped.